Hello and welcome to Buildings of Tomorrow. My name is John Lester, and in today's episode, we are talking about the grid edge. I'm joined today by Robert Klaffes. He is the CEO of Digital Grid at Siemens Smart Infrastructure. Robert, thank you for joining us.
Hey, John. Thank you very much for having me. It's great fun.
It's an absolute pleasure to have you here with us. I think we're going to have a bit of fun in this conversation because, the grid edge is one of these topics that 5 years ago we weren't really talking about so much, and it's evolving very quickly. So let's start there. What is the grid edge? What do we mean when we say this phrase?
Well, I think as the name kind of says, at the edge, typically two things meet and create an edge. And in this case, when you talk about the grid edge, on the one hand, it's the grid. So this is where the infrastructure from power supply comes and meets at the end the consumption side. And around that point where the generation or the distribution and then the consumption meet, there's a lot of interesting things that are happening now, particularly induced and fueled by the energy transition, as with the intake of more renewables into the grid, with more generation that happens on the distribution level, so the lower levels of the grid. And that is close to the grid edge, or maybe even on the consumption side, right, where you have this other world of prosumers being created or popping up that not only consume, but that also generate and then produce energy and feed back into the grid, or on the consumption side, there's an exchange. So all of it creates a lot of dynamic around that point where these worlds come together. And that's why it's such an exciting place. And so many talk is happening about it, but also real things are happening.
Yeah, and I think that's the most exciting part when we have this conversation today. Is it's not just talk anymore. Things are really starting to happen, and we're starting to see the benefits and the value that this evolution is bringing to our industry at the consumer side, and as you say, things like the evolution of the prosumer, but also from an energy perspective. Let's have a little bit of a look at those values. If we talk about the grid edge and the impact that grid edge can bring, how do you represent that from your perspective?
Well, let's start really from an overarching theme, or what's the purpose, right? I think also at Siemens we talk a lot about purpose, and a lot around in industries, societies, it's about the purpose. And when you look at it, we started to talk about more renewable generation being brought into the grid, decentral way. Why is that happening? Because we talk about decarbonizing our societies, our energy systems. All right. So for me, that's really the main driver. And that's also the big change that we have seen now over the past decade, probably, and really accelerating further. Right. I think we're in an exponential phase where the importance is more and more clear. We just had a remarkable court verdict today by the German federal, Verfassungsgericht. I don't even know this, like the main court, right? The court in Germany, the superior court or whatever it is, that ruled that what the government defined in terms of CO2 reduction, environmental protection targets, was not binding enough and precise enough, and brought it back to the government to rework this, right? So that's a major verdict, and we see it everywhere happening. So for me, this main driver is really this decarbonization effort, attempt, theme, goal that we have, and that affects then the businesses, and in our case, as smart infrastructure, both on the consumption side when it's about energy efficiency and others, and then on the generation side or the supply side when it is about the renewable generation, the integration into it. How do you manage that complexity? So driver is the decarbonization that creates then these decentralized grids, more decentralized generation. And then we talk about digitalization, and that's where I think we as a technology company, as Siemens, then we come in with grid edge, and we think also about solutions that are happening. And then we have different types of values, right? There's on the one hand with sun, wind being major contributors to energy generation. No, they're not as reliable or controllable, at least, as you have your fuel-powered rotating equipment, right? The clouds may come up, wind may die down. So this is where resilience come in. Then the other topic of sustainability, of course, already played a role. Autarky, independence plays for some people a role. That's where you get emotional. The grid edge is also not only about commercial economics, also a lot of about emotional things. And that's, I think, where you would see the main benefits that I think we can create then with technology, always driven by some underlying value drivers that are bigger than just an economic value.
Yeah, perfect. So decarbonisation is the driver that's creating the purpose, that's pushing us in this direction. Technology and digitalisation at this meeting point between the consumer and the provider of the energy space is where this work is happening and where many of these exciting things are happening. And you just mentioned a couple of really key topics: efficiency, sustainability, resilience, and independence. If you don't mind, I'd like to jump in a little bit of detail in each of these and just understand, how these are affected when we start to apply digitalization at this edge space, and some of the values or examples of how that really looks for us. So let's start with efficiency. We talked about energy efficiency, or you mentioned it. How does this drive that kind of application of technology at an edge space?
Mm-hmm. Well, again, there also the multitude of technology is interesting at the grid edge. And here, I think it is about bringing transparency on the consumption. It's very simple, the most simple way of starting to talk about efficiency, to understand how much you consume. If you look at an example, right, an industrial plant, an industrial customer that runs a plant, the first thing is how much of power or energy do I consume? And then you go further down and we say, all right, can we get more specific in the process? They have a soldering part or machine. They have a stamping machine or others. So you get more granular and you figure out how much for example, over the weekends, in the down phases, if they're not running over the weekends in the shifts, what is happening if it's in the standby phases? And we had great examples where the standby phases were consuming much more energy than when the machine was running. And that doesn't make any sense, right? So then you go back with the operator, or maybe even the operator gets then in touch with their machine supplier to then go and implement actions to address it, and then to bring down energy consumption, which at the end, as an example, of course, then create efficiency on the CO2 footprint, the sustainability aspect, but on the other hand, of course, also in the wallet of the customer, because they don't need to pay that much energy anymore, right, to their suppliers. And I think that's our very tangible examples where, again, it starts with very simple things like monitoring, understanding, and then I think you get into an action mode that can be either then with more technology, automation, automated control, or you get into like a bit deeper even into certain things where you say, okay, I then change just some settings, or I replace a machine, or whatever it is. I think that's very open. I think that's you don't need to be too narrow on that part then.
No, definitely. And I think one of the things we see is that once you have that information, what you then apply that information to and what decisions you make from it can be as broad ranging as your imagination to a certain extent. It's just getting that insight and then having the technology there to implement the decisions that you make, which really gets you to that next step. You already touched a little bit there on sustainability, and you also in your overview gave us a little bit of a hint about renewable energy and some of these different things that are also contributing to the decarbonisation. How does that overall sustainability topic then link together with the resiliency? And give us another example like the one you just used. That was great.
Yeah, I'll take two examples. One, I think a very, very obvious example, pick some islands, right? There are a lot of islands around the world with, if you compare it to, of course, large mainland cities or populations, smaller populations, but considerable if you look at it. And today still, many of those islands, they receive regular shipments of fossil fuels to then fuel and keep their diesel generations or other conventional generations running, right? And that is 24 hours. It's 24/7. I remember that I've been, since I was a child, going to some part of the world with some islands, and I remember there's this plant and it runs all the time, all day. It's a beautiful setting, it's in a tropical area, and you see the pollution going out like every second, 24/7, all year round. So what the idea is here, and we have seen implementations in several places, several geographies, where the islands also driven by their purpose, finding, say, is it really good for us to pollute? For us, maybe we don't notice that much because there's wind in an island. Typically, you won't smell it that strongly in the island itself, but you will see, okay, I have wind, I have sun. I sometimes have also some hydro, or I can do some geothermal depending on the place. And we build in a hybrid or fully renewable energy generation system that completely or partially replaces the incumbent fossil fuel generated or powered plants and generation, and then combine it with something like storage. Again, look at several renewable plus maybe a backup conventional generation, put then intelligence on top. Yeah, that's where our microgrid control or management systems come in place. And then look at how do I ensure resilience, security of supply, optimize my CO2 footprint, and the cost at the end of the day. And that is a tremendous change between or from 24/7 running, for example, on heavy diesel fuel to running 80-90% on renewable, just on solar and on wind. And that makes a big impact, and that scales island by island. And I think that's a great example, tangible, where everybody will see and understand that this helps. And the second example, a bit shorter maybe, is we're working with a partner who specialized in providing mining industry, the mining business, with hybrid generation solutions to also reduce their carbon footprint and at the same time not compromise on their independence or security of supply, because of course such an operation needs to also have security of supply, and the large machines need to keep running, because there's a very strong economic business case also behind it. But also here, if you just cut it by 50%, 60, 70%, which is possible with the solar PV technology we have in place, with some wind, with battery storage or other storage in place, combining that with a backup fossil generation, that tremendously improves the footprint, the CO2 footprint of such installations as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And already with both of those two examples, you step into that last point that you mentioned around independence, because independence is not only talking about resilience and ensuring that you're not so reliant on others that maybe don't value you as highly depending on what's required, but it also gives you freedom to make choices.
Correct.
Give us a little bit of insight around independence, a little bit more detail on some of the different aspects from that perspective.
Yeah. I mean, here I think strongest, although also the sustainability portion is a very emotional one. I think we all know it because either you believe in our impact on nature and on the environment, or people tell us, well, there is no climate change and we can do what we want. So this is really emotional. This is where you can't. I have such discussion with some part of my family sometimes, and I can tell you this is not rational anymore. And I get very excited then as well, because I'm more of the fraction. I say we need to do and really act strongly on it. But the same on independence. Some people say I'm fascinated by the idea that if I'm a homeowner, or if we are a small village or a community, to say actually we're completely independent. We harvest what nature gives us, and we use it, and we can even create business cases by feeding back or providing some services to the utilities for grid stability and so on. And then I think is an interesting aspect, and it comes in different shades, right? And I think it's not to be underestimated, especially in this world where today everybody knows everything. Basically, everything is possible. I think we live in a world where we believe, and in many cases it's true, technology enables us to do everything, live our dreams. If they're real or just a virtual, it doesn't matter. But a lot is possible, and that's where I think this emotional aspect comes in. The other portion, which is more down to earth, it's called it independent, or at the end, it's just also, how do we improve the quality of life of people, of society? Some example I didn't mention before because it's maybe a bit of a different category. We also have a few examples, and there's many other people who help. I think other communities to get to that stage is when you're an off-grid environment. Like you have some villages that are so remote. that have not had electricity before. There was not an individual diesel plant there. They were living and going to ponds, wells to get their water. They didn't have electricity. Kids couldn't learn at night because they didn't have light bulbs and so on. And I think this is examples where you say, instead of putting a lot of money and a lot of, at the end, again, natural resources into building grid connections to very remote places, maybe also you would say the critical mass is not there, neither economically, also environmentally. It's questionable to put a line to something very remote. But then this now gives us the opportunity in a very reasonable environmental footprint, creating value for people and also independence because they're able to generate their own electricity and then get all these advantages, let alone imagine a refrigeration, right, to keep food safe and fresh for longer. And I think, again, it's so tangible, so real. And that's what today technology and where we have moved over the last decades now as humanity, I think, open great opportunities. And for me, this is what I associate to this aspect of independence.
Yeah, beautiful. What I really like about the last 5 or 6 minutes when we've talked around these key benefits. So we talked about efficiency, sustainability, resilience, independence. We really covered a huge scope between, really cost savings and energy savings for a business, driven also with sustainability for decarbonization, that resilience to make sure that you have the confidence, the capability to continue to operate as a business or even as a society. And then right through to this last piece, we were talking about independence, which is not only just a piece of this business model, but also can be a really life-changing situation for a particular community. Because when we talk about energy, it's not so much the electricity that we get if we think about our homes, but it's what we do with it and what we're enabled to do. Access to information and healthcare and all of these different things that kind of give us the life that many of us are used to at the moment. You mentioned just before, that emotional conversation when we talk about decarbonization, when we talk about energy efficiency and the challenge that we have as a society, as a globe, let's call it, to really address this challenge with climate change. And driven by decarbonization and sustainability and energy efficiency, we have some difficult goals to reach. Mm-hmm. One of my last questions is, you've talked a little bit about some of the technologies. When we talk about grid edge, we've talked about the topics. You talked around, PV, so photovoltaic, so solar panels. We talk about wind power, so renewable energies, energy storage, hybrid generation, distribution technology, and automation. Why is it so important? Why is the pressure on time now? And what's different? What enables us to really achieve and make a difference today that maybe we couldn't do 10 years, 20 years ago?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, I think as we started, I think the sustainability importance has increased so much, and it's in many cases in change processes, it's a mindset question. And I think probably also 10, 15 years ago, we would have been able to do a lot of things, but we were not mentally ready. And when I say we, I speak about humans, right? Humanity. If you look at scale, right? We talk about like scale now. I think that is the biggest change that has happened. And on the other hand, of course, it's easy to talk about the nice things when they're abstract and it doesn't touch me personally. At the end, if I, as a user, need to personally put something on the table or maybe refrain on certain things or say no and reduce on whatever, it's difficult. Yeah, it's more difficult to say I need to pay a lot more money to basically get the same service that now is a bit more green. Isn't it easier to just put a few cool tweets out and say, yeah, I'm all for it, but when it touches me myself, then better let someone else do it, right? And then everybody benefits. And I think that changed the PV module prices came down so much, the storage prices go down so much, the automation scaled so much, right? Because there's more and more demand for it, so we can scale on the solution. It becomes more economic. So I think all of that helps that the economical barrier which I think if we're honest to ourselves as humans always exists. I think we're champions in speaking nice words. We're sometimes not so good in making it happen, because there's always at the back of our minds, there's the bills that are there and we count them, and it matters. And so I think that happened over the past decade strongly, that the threshold, the entry barrier has decreased tremendously. And these two things coming together, and while I would even say that this mindset, this readiness thing that we say, it really matters now. There is no talking around it anymore. More and more people believe in it. More science supports it, and people see it. When you go out and you travel, you see how we're consuming resource and how we have an impact. And I think that's the main driver. And then supported by that lower entry barrier, I think that's how things are speeding up now.
Yeah, perfect. And it's that speed that's really the key, isn't it? Because if we are going to meet the expectations that we've set for ourselves, but also the expectations that we know now from the science we need to meet, it's not an option, it's required. It's the speed that really matters. Robert, thank you so much for the conversation today. It's great. I hope it's not the last one, because I feel like we covered a lot of different things. And for each of these things, there is a lot more detail and a lot more knowledge to look at. But thank you so much for the time and for joining us today.
Thank you very much for having me, Ton.
It's an absolute pleasure. And then to everyone else that's also listening, thank you for joining us. Remember to like, share, comment this episode, subscribe to us wherever you're listening or watching us, and look out for new episodes every time. Every week we have something new for you, and hopefully there'll be some more with Robert around Grid Edge at some point in the future as well. So thank you very much, and we'll see you soon.